Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. I seem to be the only person that's shown up with a dog. What can you do? But it's great to introduce you because she is one of the Ave Labs. Oh. You'll be absolutely delighted to know there's plenty more where that came from. But it is a pleasure to be with you, and what I'd like to do is talk a bit about my mission, how it aligns to so much that we've heard so far in this fabulous conference in such a glorious venue. What a gathering to talk about the future now. And to be utterly up to the minute, you see, she's already going to sleep. Do feel free to follow her example if I'm losing you at any point. But you just heard from the previous speaker about the great Sir William Curtis, who set out, as he called them, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Obviously, that was a problem, as was said. Only one of them was an R. But look at what a visionary Sir William was. Because he knew full well then, he knew that they weren't 3 R's, but in going, reading, writing, and arithmetic, he knew then he was going RWA, real world assets in the 18th century. That is a visionary, my friends. That is a visionary. And we all need to believe, because we are on the leading edge. By being here, you are all visionaries in this future technology now. And it's why I'm so proud to be able to be in Parliament, in many ways representing everything that you're all trying to do. I've been lucky enough to co-write select committee reports on democracy and digital technologies, on financial inclusion, on AI, on digital skills and inclusion, everything that this gathering is all about. In fact, in 2016, I wrote a report off my own back on distributed ledger technologies because I saw the huge possibilities then in almost any sector which you'd choose to look at. I did 3 years on the Science Select Committee, and I've just begun 3 years on the Digital Select Committee. So everything very much in this space. And what I believe threads all of this together, everything that we've heard so far this morning, everything that you will hear over the next 2.5 days, what connects all of it, if we get this right, is that beautiful golden thread of inclusion and innovation. That is how we bring all this to life. Because how can we have the best proposition, the best product, the best development, if we don't have every possible voice, perspective, background in the mix? I say inclusion and innovation. In many ways, it's inclusion for innovation. And yet, when you look out there, across this country, across the world, all of the positivity here can feel like it is hitting up against some really powerful negative forces right now. Populism, protectionism, retreatism. If we look at the geopolitical and the macroeconomic, it all lines up to being an extraordinarily difficult time to be trying to make positive inputs. But in spite of all of that, the mission remains the same, because we all have the great good fortune of being born human. And when we connect, when we collaborate, when we create, the opportunities are as good as infinite. But again, the contradictions. We've never been more connected, and yet we have an epidemic of loneliness. We've never been more connected, and yet isolation and that feeling of atomization has never been at a higher point. And yet, if we just hold true to everything that we have from having had the great good fortune of being born human, and we connect and we collaborate, then we absolutely can. By human leading on these technologies in our human hands. You've already heard this morning so many great examples of deployment of the technology. To describe them as tools in some ways may feel like I'm underplaying them. I'm giving them not the respect that they rightly deserve, but not a bit of it. They are tools, incredibly powerful tools, but by conceiving of them as tools, we can imagine them in our human hands and how we then determine, as so many of you in this room do, how we build with those tools in our human hands. And I want to slay two myths today, two false dichotomies. The first is that you can have innovation or you can have regulation. You can't have both. Every epoch, every piece of human history, not least recent human history, tells me completely the opposite. Right-sized regulation, good for innovation, good for investment, good for citizen, creative, good for consumers, good for our countries. Now, we all know bad regulation. There's a fair bit of that out there. But that, in no sense, means that regulation of itself is bad. That's bad regulation. Right-sized regulation is the route that every jurisdiction, every government, and every nation, and below that, every regulator should be on. And you only need to look at English common law as the greatest example of that. The rules-based order. Because what do you want if you're an investor or an innovator or a creator or a builder or developer? You want clarity, you want certainty, you want consistency. That doesn't come from an unregulated landscape. How is it that you could have two parties in, say, Senegal contracting for a piece of business which doesn't involve the UK? The business isn't going to be done in the UK, and those people aren't even going to come to the UK, but they do the deal in English law and submit to the courts of England and Wales because of the certainty, the clarity, the consistency over hundreds of years that comes from our common law tradition. The same approach needs to be taken in this country and around the world when it comes to regulation. And ensuring that we have it principles-based, outcomes-focused, inputs understood. To those principles, trust and transparency, inclusion and innovation, already mentioned, interoperability and an international perspective, critical. Decentralized, permissionless, accountable, accessible, assurable. Good principles when we're regulating, developing and deploying tech. Good principles, I'd argue, for pretty much anything that we would wish to be involved with. Right-sized regulation, underpinned by those principles, not just a way forward, but the optimal way forward. A couple of examples. The fintech regulatory sandbox that I was involved in almost a decade ago. Built here, deployed here, measure of success, well, replicated in well over 50 jurisdictions around the world. Open banking, the Competition and Markets Authority CMA 9 order, a deliberate, a willed regulatory intervention because of a market failure. We willed it, we wanted it, we created it, we rolled it out. Measure of success, not only replicated in well over 60 jurisdictions around the world, but many of those jurisdictions now having gone much further than the UK in their deployment. It's just like us, with so many of the sports that we created in the Victorian times, and now around the world, we get well and truly thrashed at those same sports. World Series Baseball, though. I know we've got a lot of Americans here. Great game, World Series Baseball. Not many teams outside the US playing in that World Series, though. Greater connection. Let's open up to the world if we're going to optimize, create, collaborate, and make great stuff happen. So that's the first thing that I wanted to slay. This sense that you can have innovation or regulation. You can't have the both. What we need, right-size regulation, clarity, certainty, consistency that flows from that. The second myth I want to murder is that legislators, parliaments, can't keep up with technology. We're always going to be legislating for the last or the second, third, fourth last technology. It's entirely possible that that can happen, and we've certainly seen enough examples of it, and things certainly become problematic if one takes a prescriptive approach to legislating. But again, the reality is, it's in our human hands. We know what we need to know to legislate in a leading edge, agile, adaptable, flexible way if we so choose. Let me give you a couple of recent examples that I led on. Now, I'm going to say something in a minute, and I'm going to feel this sense. You'll be too polite to yawn out loud, but I think there's going to be a big from you. You ready? The Electronic Trade Documents Act. I know. It doesn't immediately go, why are you talking about that at a gathering such as this? Well, I'll tell you for why. Because it was a small, elegantly constructed piece of legislation that we got through in very quick time, and it did something very simple, very effective, and it demonstrated that not only were we leading edge, but we were ahead of the curve when it came to legislating for these technological opportunities. Let me talk a bit about it. It sounds like it's a trade bill. In reality, it's a technology-enabled bill. I described it variously as the most important law no one has ever heard of, and the blockchain bill that never once mentions blockchain. And it is smart because of that. Because of the approach we took by making it criteria-based, it had adaptability, flexibility, agility. It made it both technology neutral and technology future-proofed. What does it do? Very simply, it enables trade documents to be held in electronic form. Now, many of you may think, God, that's so old. You've been able to do digital documents for decades. But the key thing about trade documents, like bearer bonds, possessive in their quality. Thus, you hold the paper, you hold the goods. So the technology had to exist to be able to put the legislation in place. So if you held that electronic document, you had to be able to show no one else could hold it and perfect transfer, that you no longer had any rights around it. And it is blockchain and other technologies that enabled us to do that. And what a stunning thing. A small number of clauses of a statute, enabling trade to now be perfected in minutes rather than the average 10 to 14 days. Economic benefits, increased liquidity, potential new pools of liquidity through a secondary market in those financial instruments, and environmental benefits, not least because somebody no longer has to get on a plane at Heathrow with a document wallet, fly to, say, Singapore to connect that document with the goods in the port of Singapore to perfect that transfer. Smart, leading edge, simple, ahead of where the industry was. Yes, we can do this with legislation. Secondly, the Property Digital Assets Bill that I've been leading on in Parliament. We had the last stages of that in the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago. Again, an elegant two-clause bill which clarifies the property rights around digital assets. We'd already set out the regime for stablecoins in the Financial Services and Markets Act of 2023, so we did a lot of work on that. It's something like 350 pages. I've read all of them, so you don't have to. Thank you. But what the Property Digital Assets Bill, soon to be Act, does is give that clarity, that certainty, that consistency that for those trading, custodianing, whatever element of the digital assets ecosystem one finds oneself in, there's increased clarity about the property rights that attach to those digital assets. I won't go into the English law tradition around things in possession, things in action, but essentially by putting this bill through, it enables a potential third category of property rights which attaches more clearly to the particular characteristics, as you all know, around digital assets. So Electronic Trade Documents Act, Property Digital Assets Bill. Can the legislators get involved with these technologies, with these possibilities, and legislate not only in good time, but legislate in a forward-looking way? Yes, we can. Is there enough of it? No, there isn't. We need to bring the DAO bill through as next, I think. And what I'm trying to do is have a pathway of these small but perfected and specific pieces of legislation which enable, and empower the economic, the social, the national and the global benefits of these new technologies to be felt by citizen, consumer, our cities, our countries, in an increasingly, if we get it right, positively connected world. Now, I cover AI, blockchain, cyber, digital assets tokenization, with ED&I and ESG as threads running through all of that. We've talked a lot rightly this morning around digital assets and tokenization. The opportunities, not least economic, are stunning of themselves just with that technology. But where things, I believe, become even more interesting is when we look at these technologies in combination, in concert with one another. Look about what we can achieve when we combine blockchain and AI. One simple example, some of the issues around AI with provenance of the data, an obvious blockchain solution. Similarly, some of the issues with power usage, AI and blockchain can interact to really get after those issues and have far more efficient running data centers. Data centers of the future, they are the foundries, the factories which are fueling these new technologies. We need to ensure that we have those as optimized, as leading edge as we possibly can, if we're going to truly say these are not only the technologies, but they are powered in a future-proofed, planetary-saving manner. So I've also introduced a bill briefly on AI to look about how we maximize the opportunities there, to have a small, nimble, agile AI authority to look across the economy, to see how we optimize all existing regulators, where regulatory gaps exist, how we can ensure that that technology is deployed in a right-sized manner. To have AI officers in all organizations, to have labeling, and to have IP and copyright rightly respected. But the reality when it comes to AI, when it comes to blockchain, DLT, when it comes to digital assets, tokenization, crypto, where are we as a parliament? Where are we as a society? Where are we as a country? Where are we as a planet? The truth of it is, there are nowhere near enough people engaged in the discourse, in the debate, in the discussion, in the arguments around how we plot this human-led technology's future now. That's why the most important clauses that I've put into a number of bills are all around public engagement. Because without that public engagement, how do we really optimize that first principle that I set out, that principle of trust? And with no trust, how do we get 1 billion on blockchain? But with that trust, with that real engagement, the opportunities for individual empowerment like we have never seen in human history up to this point, and what can come from that, absolutely stellar. And the great good news is we know how to do this. One quick example. Look about when IVF, in vitro fertilization, was proposed decades ago. What could be more scientific, what could be more terrifying than bringing human life into being in a laboratory test tube? Why is it seen not only as a positive part of our lives, but it's largely faded into the background as just a normal part of our lives? Because decades ago, a colleague of mine, the now late, the great Baroness Warnock, went up and down the country with the Warnock Commission, engaging with the public, asking them what did they want from this new technology? Where did they want the perimeter, the boundaries to be drawn? Hence, a positive, normal, natural fading into the background technology. And in a sense, that, in conclusion, is the fundamental truth. Human society has always had technology right from the outset. It's always at its best when it's human-led technologies. Look to 3,000 years BC, at least, in finance, when people were flicking the abacus. The abacus, the greatest technology of that time. So if technology has always been there, and we know that human-led is the best way to optimize, then what do we conclude? We need to conclude that it's us who determine, it's us who decide, it's us who deploy, and if we get it right, it's us who, with these human-led technologies, it's us who delight. We all have a role to play, and we all must play that role. And if we do, what an extraordinary thing. The transformation, the transition together to social, economic, psychological, shared benefits, together our $1 trillion future. Thank you very much.